Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about the strength of schedule for the rest of the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking rest of season strength of schedule at the running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end positions because we're trying to give ourselves more context as to which players not only have the most advantageous matchups going forward that are going to lead to their overall upside of potential, but we're talking about who could potentially help us win a 2021 fantasy football championship. Now, of course, a singular running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, their skill as a whole and the teams that they play on do make a big difference, but we talk about it every single week. Matchups are a huge factor in regards to whether or not a player is going to perform well. So we'll talk about, based on already what we've seen from weeks 1 through 5 and how many points defenses have given up to opposing running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends thus far this season, who has the most advantageous schedules going forward, and which of these players we should potentially be targeting to bring over to our team to help us win and achieve that 2021 fantasy football championship that we're all trying to, of course, accomplish this season. Now, before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support. You guys continue to come out. We just recently surpassed 54,000 subscribers, but we're not stopping anytime soon. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season, whether it is strength of schedule videos, rest of season rankings, which will come out next week. Of course, hidden gems tomorrow, Sunday morning live streams, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. On Monday, we'll talk about waiver wire pickups. Of course, there's a Bipocalypse coming in week 7. We got to prepare for that. And of course, the weekly rankings, more content ahead. For those of you interested and haven't yet already, you're new to the channel, smash that like button. And of course, do not forget to subscribe to the channel to help yourself win a 2021 fantasy football championship this season. Outside of that, let's not forget about Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who haven't checked them out, it's another way to play fantasy football. And you don't even have to play fantasy football for the NFL anymore, because not only is there pick'ems for the NFL, but now for college football, for those of you who are trying to put your skills to the test as to whether or not a player is going to succeed or go under their specific stat range. Other than pick'ems, there's things like the weekly contests, there's rest of season contests, and much more there to just enjoy the fantasy football season to a greater extent. Whether or not you drafted enough teams, or perhaps your teams are like mine in some circumstances where you have an entire injured roster or an entire bench filled with bye weeks, and you're not looking like you're going to have a great week, just go ahead and forget about that. Sign up with Underdog Fantasy today. With your first deposit of $10 or more using promo code Andrew, you'll be given an additional $10 in bonus cash, which you can use this weekend to not only potentially win some prizes, but also have some more fun in terms of playing fantasy football and fantasy sports in general. Please check them out. And again, that's promo code Andrew. All right. Let's talk about the strength of schedule for the rest of the 2021 fantasy football season. To put it into context, last night's game between the Philadelphia Eagles and Tampa Bay Buccaneers, that is being taken into account based on what they did between weeks 1 through 5. I'm going to kind of forget about what they did last night, but there is a pattern of success and or failures that we need to always look at. And there's a reason why I talk about strength of schedule. Let's talk about the Philadelphia Eagles last night and why Leonard Fournette was such a great overall fantasy play. Let's not forget the Philadelphia Eagles, for 3 consecutive weeks there, were giving up a bunch of points on the ground to opposing running backs, whether it was Zeke, then Clyde Edwards-Helaire, then Chuba Hubbard. There is a pattern of success or failures that we want to, of course, pay attention to, because matchups play a huge role in the entire aspect of fantasy football. And I find that a lot of people ignore that factor and in times, just really don't take advantage of it. It's another advantage that we can take and go ahead and help us succeed on a weekly basis. And that's why I focus on it so much throughout an entire week, because matchups do play a huge role. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, in regards, beginning with the running back position, let's put it into context. Between weeks 1 through 5, defenses versus the running back position, how many points have defenses given up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format? I, of course, presented the numbers to the very left of the screen earlier this week during the running back rankings video. As we can see, the New York Giants, Los Angeles Chargers, Detroit Lions, Miami Dolphins, Jacksonville Jaguars, they are all giving up 26 or more fantasy points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average. Those are unbelievable numbers. And by the way, I just look at it, I think to myself, well, these teams are in line for great performances going forward. So why not go ahead and potentially, play teams that are going to go against them? But again, we have 11 games left in the regular season. So if we go ahead and we take those numbers based on the difficulty of a schedule and we spread it out in a spreadsheet based on what teams have to play going forward, the statistics to the right of it and the rankings there are presenting what the strength of schedule is at the running back position from weeks 6 through 17 rest of season. As you can see, the easiest strength of schedule on average is going to be the Los Angeles Rams, followed by the Philadelphia Eagles, Cincinnati Bengals, Denver Broncos, Houston Texans. And on the other side of the coin, some of the tougher matchups at the running back position reside with the Arizona Cardinals, New England Patriots, the Raiders, the Lions, and the Washington football team. Now, let's go ahead and let's just kind of talk about this, because I will go into more advanced details in regards to rest of the regular season and then the fantasy playoffs. But let's just talk about this at a surface level. Darrell Henderson is the thumbnail for a reason, and it's because he has the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position going forward. And though many people may be concerned about what is going to potentially happen with Sony Michel, whether he's getting more work, I'm not worried about it. I wasn't worried about it in the offseason when the trade was made, and that's why I suggested all of you to draft him. He's currently averaging 15.35 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. And the fact that his offensive line has looked better than they have in years, and he's just producing out of his mind, and the schedule is so, favorable for him going forward, why not go ahead and potentially invest in him if you don't already have him? Maybe go and make a move to bring Darrell Henderson into your team. Outside of that, other running backs, let's talk about this from the top bottom. The Philadelphia Eagles backfield. In terms of Miles Sanders, he's currently averaging 4.74 yards per carry. In comparison to a lot of other running backs, he is a significantly more efficient running back, but he's not given opportunities. With that said, let's say, for example, Kenneth Gainwell. He scored 2 rushing touchdowns already this season. Imagine if those rushing touchdowns were actually given to Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders would be the number 20 overall running back right now if we exclude the Thursday night game and all the points that he had in that contest and or whatever Leonard Fournette did. He would be a top 24 back, and that's what we anticipated, pretty much seeing him this offseason, but the touchdowns haven't gotten there yet. If you're willing to take the risk, I understand this team isn't running the ball, but again, they did play against Tampa Bay last night. And it's not a bad option because rest of season, the schedule is beginning to look pretty clean for Miles Sanders going forward. The next running back here, we have Joe Mixon. You guys may be wondering why a couple weeks back, or specifically last week during my trade targets video, I suggested Joe Mixon. Because again, the Cincinnati Bengals rest of season have a beautiful strength of schedule. You want to talk about another running back that I'm all in on and trading for? Javonte Williams. I'm going to go ahead and throw it up right here. If you guys haven't checked out my trade targets video from last week, I talked about these players and in a wider, kind of extent, just to give you more perspective as to exactly what matchups they have coming forward and why I'm going after them, specifically Javonte Williams, because he does look like he's going to have that Dobbins, DeAndre Swift, Cam Akers-esque back end of the season explosion of productivity, because again, this is the final year on Melvin Gordon's contract in Denver, and they want to transition to Javonte Williams for the future. There's a reason why they drafted him. So again, another player there. In terms of the Houston Texans, I understand it's favorable, but that's a running back by committee. We're not really touching that. Let's talk about Myles Gaskin. Myles Gaskin pretty much saved his entire season with last week's performance of 26.9 half PPR fantasy points. But with that said, Tua is returning to the lineup, and that does potentially present more targets in the direction of a Myles Gaskin. But in terms of his overall efficiency and productivity, he's averaging 4.9 yards per carry this season. And as long as they are going to give him more and more opportunity, as we progress, he should find more and more success. It's a matter of, similar to Miles Sanders, very underwhelming RB2 candidates that have most recently been RB3s. And unless they're going to change something going forward, it's going to be tough. Moving on, Pittsburgh Steelers, Najee Harris, automatic success because he's been great already. David Montgomery, another one of those running backs that I mentioned in my trade targets video, because he is, and we'll talk about it in about 2 minutes, going to probably be one of those league-winning running backs because of the fantasy playoff schedule that he has, or potentially getting you into the playoffs. James Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, of course, with the with the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Colts, Carolina Panthers with McCaffrey, Dallas with Zeke, Green Bay with Aaron Jones. A lot of these running backs that are already studs have incredible schedules, guys. And for those of you wondering, hey, you know what? I have Alvin Kamara, I have Derrick Henry, I have Dalvin Cook, and they're not in this conversation, Andrew. I have Austin Eckler. Should I be worried? Absolutely not. A lot of the running backs already either had tough strength of schedule and have proven that they can pretty much slug through it. Going back to the offseason, I talked about strength of schedule at the running back position, and it was honestly a factor that the Detroit Lions were set to have the toughest strength of schedule for the 2021 season at the running back position. And as of this current moment in time, still do. Going into the rest of this season, I'm not worried about DeAndre Swift. He's already proven that with that PPR work, with the upside that they continue to get there in Detroit, there's a lot of value to be at. So a lot of the stud running backs, I'm not worried about. But there's guys that may be fringe plays that I'm like, do I really want to spend, and put all my marbles into the Damian Harris basket with him not being healthy, with him not getting receiving work, and that offense just not, scoring as much as they potentially should be? There's a lot of other factors in that capacity that we have to, of course, take into account. But Now that we've covered this, hopefully this gives you more perspective. Let's move on to an extended pace in terms of what we can talk about at the running back position. As you can see to the very left side of the screen, I have separated the strength of schedule at the running back position between weeks 6 through 14 and 15 through 17. For context, the fantasy football playoffs for every single one of your leagues should start in week 15 because the final bye weeks end in week 14. I know for a fact off the top of my head, the Eagles have a week 14 bye. So taking that into account, the rest of the regular season for your fantasy football season, whether or not you make the playoffs, goes as such. The Cincinnati Bengals, Pittsburgh Steelers, Carolina Panthers, Rams, Eagles, teams that we just mentioned have the easiest strength of schedule for the next 11 weeks. With that taken into account, of course, again, do not worry about your stud running backs having tougher strength of schedules, but look for guys that maybe you can go ahead and get for a little bit of a discount and maybe help you win games going forward and into the future, particularly in the fantasy football playoffs. Now, speaking of the fantasy football playoffs, we have the RB weeks 15 through 17. Again, do not play a week 18 championship game. That would be a huge mistake. Please have your commissioner change that now if they can go ahead and do so. Nonetheless, the Houston Texans, we talked about them. It's an RBBC. We're not interested. Again, Darrell Henderson and the Rams show up once again here. We have the Chicago Bears with Montgomery. We have Denver with Javonte Williams, who will have a huge fantasy playoff potential explosion of productivity. I keep saying it. Probably is going to happen. The Eagles, the Jaguars, the Tennessee Titans. Another year where Derrick Henry can go ahead and crown not only himself the king, but their league managers the king of that specific league. The Atlanta Falcons, whether or not we see Cordero Patterson still active in that offense by then, we'll of course have to see. The Detroit Lions with DeAndre Swift, Miami Dolphins, San Francisco 49ers, Cowboys. There's a lot of teams that continue to repeat in this category. I just want to go ahead, give you some more context, show you exactly what the strength of schedule looks like for the rest of the season. A lot of the players in this top 12 are, not only household names, but names that everybody in your league, whether they're experienced or not, are very, very familiar with, based on the fact that if they just watch football, they hear these names every single weekend popping off. So just putting this into context, these are the strength of schedules from weeks 6 through 14, 15 through 17. Do with it what you must. We're going to move on to the wide receiver position now. So as you can see to the very left, I've gone ahead and taken the stats that I presented earlier this week as to how many points defenses have given up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. Now, with that said, that's the Tennessee Titans, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Pittsburgh Steelers, Washington football team, and Miami Dolphins. A lot of these teams, in fact, specifically the Steelers, the Washington football team, the Miami Dolphins, they were great last season. So when we anticipated, teams going up against them in the offseason, we thought they'd definitely be tougher matchups. But like we always see in fantasy football, we cannot anticipate injuries and or different rotational changes of how defenses have kind of worked their way through. Some defenses decline. They don't find as much potential success in a given season because you never stay the same. You either improve or get worse, and that's just how it is. And that's why some of these teams are in are giving up more points than they did by a significant margin in comparison to last year. But with that said, let's talk about wide receivers from weeks 6 through 16 and what their strength of schedule average is going forward and who has the easiest one. The number one ranked team in the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position belongs to the San Francisco 49ers, and that is mainly going to help Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk has not been a factor, and a lot of the Ayuk hype, for me specifically, came from the fact that all season long they were going to have a good strength of schedule, but unfortunately has been relatively underutilized. It's unfortunate, but hopefully, again, we still have another 12 weeks of fantasy football left here. Hopefully, we can get some production out of it. Moving on, we have the Carolina Panthers, which, of course, DJ Moore, incredible going forward. Outside of Moore, I'm not really interested in other potential options there. Of course, we'd love to see Robbie Anderson or Terrace Marshall take another step forward, but they haven't been able to do so thus far this season. We have the Houston Texans. Brandon Cooks, pretty much the only guy that I'm interested in there. Michael Thomas and the New Orleans Saints. I talked about it with the running back section. I've talked about Michael Thomas in the past 2 trade targets videos because once he gets involved in this offense, going forward, Jameis has an easy slate of games. Not to mention, do they play all of the teams within their division except for the Carolina Panthers because they already played them in week 2. So they play the Carolina Panthers one more time, then they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers twice and the Falcons twice. Those are easy matchups. The NFC South matchups are always shootouts. And especially for Jameis, who's so comfortable and so experienced against those respective teams and the revenge game he's going to have, it is very exciting for a guy like Michael Thomas and the Saints based on the coverage that they're potentially going to see going forward. Devontae Adams doesn't need an easy strength of schedule, but he gets one anyway with the 5th easiest going forward. The Detroit Lions, I don't know who's going to be the number one there. We're all hoping it's Amon-Ra St. Brown, the rookie wide receiver, because we always want to see rookie wide receivers succeed and be immediate fantasy impactful plays. But we'll have to go ahead and just keep an eye on that. The Seattle Seahawks, the Dallas Cowboys, the Las Vegas Raiders, these are other teams following that, of course, have easier strength of schedules, but the Raiders receivers, not interested. The Dallas Cowboys, great. Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb going forward, that is exciting news. The Seahawks, it depends when, right? Because if Russell Wilson's not there, what difference does it make if Geno Smith's not able to get the ball to them at an active rate and giving them enough valuable touches? You can have targets, but if the volume of targets is half of them 10 yards over their head or, away from their body on the ground, the quality of targets truly do matter in a lot of these circumstances. And we don't know what Geno Smith is really going to be capable of until Russell Wilson returns. We have, of course, the Chicago Bears. Again, with Justin Fields at quarterback, doesn't really seem like that's something that we could take advantage of. The Buffalo Bills, they're going to be killing it. Of course, whether it's Stephon Diggs, Emmanuel Sanders, Cole Beasley going forward. This is why I keep talking about let's go and let's buy Stephon Diggs as cheap as you possibly can, because now or never. Also, with A.J. Brown, now or never, the Tennessee Titans, and we'll talk about it in just a minute, they've got a really good strength of schedule going forward. So let's transition, now that we've kind of given you some context here, to the rest of the season. Again, do not forget, if you have a player that perhaps is on the Cincinnati Bengals or the Chargers, yes, the strength of schedule gets tougher, but some of these guys are matchup proof, and they're going to continue to succeed regardless of what's ahead of them. So let's see how we can separate the wide receiver position based on weeks 6 through 14, the next 11 games, and of course, what we're going to potentially see out of the fantasy football playoffs. So rest of regular season, before the fantasy football playoffs begins, we have the Houston Texans, Green Bay Packers, Jacksonville Jaguars, Carolina Panthers, Buffalo Bills, a lot of the teams we just mentioned that have the easiest strength of schedules. And of course, on the bottom of this list, almost identical to the page that we just looked at, Miami Dolphins, Cincinnati Bengals, the Indianapolis Colts, Patriots, they have the tougher strength of schedules going forward. Does that concern me? If in fact we're talking about quarterback play that is going to be lesser, then maybe in fact I am worried about Mac Jones or Carson Wentz. But as for the case of Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers, I'm also concerned there because Jalen Hurts is just running the ball the entire year. But nonetheless, we'll keep an eye on that. As for the fantasy football playoffs, a lot of people going early in the season want to prepare for that, and they want to go ahead and gather enough talent to succeed in those fantasy football playoffs. The Tennessee Titans, they have maybe one of the easiest strength of schedules going into this week comparatively to all other positions. In the fantasy football playoffs, they are going to feast. The Jets, probably as well, but by the time we get there, it's a matter of what Zach Wilson looks like in relation to Corey Davis, Jamison Crowder, Elijah Moore, Denzel Mims, and how they're going to be able to produce. The Philadelphia Eagles, they go ahead and have a little bit of a switch up here. From going from one of the toughest strength of schedules from week 6 through 14, they hit a bye week in week 14, and then they get themselves a beautiful slate of games in the fantasy football playoffs. Devonta Smith could be a great option there if you could trade for him late. The Detroit Lions, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dallas Cowboys. Of course, we always like our Steelers, specifically Deontay Johnson with Juju Smith out. Claypool becomes another great option here for the fantasy football playoffs. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and present these numbers, give you guys some context as to who has the easiest strength of schedules going forward for, of course, the wide receiver position. And now that we have that potentially to our advantage, you can go ahead, pick this the way you want, and check out their strength of schedules. Go and look at just how easy it is for the Tennessee Titans from weeks 15, 16, and 17. Take a look for yourself and just understand, wow, they've got these specific slate of games, and why not just go ahead and potentially invest in them? Either way, the wide receiver position, we're moving on to quarterbacks. Now, a lot of you have your stud quarterback, and to be honest, you don't have to pivot. But for those of you who unfortunately fell victim to grabbing a Tannehill and has been a shell of himself, doesn't even look remotely like the Ryan Tannehill of old, whether it is because of the offensive coordinator change or whatever the heck happened this offseason, it is unfortunate. But to give you some context, defenses versus the quarterback position in a 4-point per passing touchdown format, how many points have they given up to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season on average between weeks 1 through 5? The Kansas City Chiefs, Washington football team, Indianapolis Colts, Cowboys, and Browns have given up the most points to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season on average. If we take that into account and expand that for the remainder of the games from week 6 through 17 of the 2021 fantasy football season, we would find that the Las Vegas Raiders, Arizona Cardinals, New Orleans Saints, Houston Texans, and Washington football team have the easiest strength of schedules going forward, followed by the rest of these teams. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the Browns, the Miami Dolphins, Tom Brady and the Buccaneers, Herbert and the Chargers with some tougher strength of schedule. But I'll continue to mention, regardless of how the strength of schedule looks for a quarterback, if they are your stud quarterback, Brady, Herbert, Kyler, Dak, Aaron Rodgers, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, if they're your stud quarterback, you don't have to worry about them. They're guys that you're starting regardless, and you're not blinking because why play it, like that? Maybe if you have Hurts and Brady on the same team, you can have that conversation every week. But in regards to having just one stud and perhaps a backup like, a Kirk Cousins or a Sam Darnold or a Burrow, they are there for the insurance and or the bye week play. So do not forget that. For those of you who are struggling at the quarterback position, of course, Derek Carr has a really good strength of schedule going forward, but based on what is happening with that organization and the fact that Gruden was calling majority of the plays there, it's just a matter of, is that offense going to look the same? We'll have to kind of keep an eye on that and whether or not they're able to take the potential of their upcoming schedule and to make the most of it, honestly. Now, we also have the Arizona Cardinals. That is good for Kyler Murray, considering he has looked pedestrian in the last 3 consecutive weeks. Hopefully, rest of season, the guy can ball out. Jameis Winston, in the first couple of weeks, wasn't able to surpass 200 passing yards. This last week against Washington, killed it. Beautiful. We'll take that. And of course, with Michael Thomas returning, like I mentioned earlier during the wide receiver section, there's a lot of NFC South high-scoring matchups to be had between the Saints and either the Falcons, Buccaneers, and Panthers. I'm excited for those matchups. The Washington football team and or the Houston Texans. Davis Mills, Tyrod Taylor. If Taylor comes back and picks up where he left off, I'm interested in potentially going ahead and investing in him as a backup quarterback option in potential good matchups, maybe against the Jaguars or the Colts or the Tennessee Titans, teams against his own respective division that can be easier. As for teams like the Washington football team and the Jaguars, I did expect Trevor Lawrence to have a better season this year. Of course, DJ Chark going out the last couple weeks, he hasn't played well through the air, but on the ground is at least getting himself more and more production. I could see him later on in the season becoming more and more of a viable play, but even this week, I think he's a good play against Miami. That being said, we don't know what the deal with Taylor Heineke is. Is he going to keep the job? I think he's earned to keep the job, but if Ryan Fitzpatrick comes back and Taylor Heineke has himself a bad game, Fitzpatrick could be leading this team and having himself some good games later on in the season. The Titans with Ryan Tannehill, I know he has a good strength of schedule, but can we trust it? That's the question. The Pittsburgh Steelers, Big Ben, really hasn't had a good game all season long. But then we look at the 49ers here. If Trey Lance is going to be the quarterback rest of the way, then maybe we can have a conversation here. But in regards to currently rest of season, it's kind of tough to presume that he would be taking the job if Jimmy Garoppolo is healthy and based on the fact that he is dealing with an injury. But either way, let's go ahead and move on and separate the quarterback position from week 6 through 14 and 15 through 17, the rest of the regular season for the fantasy football season and the fantasy football playoffs. Again, it's very similar. We have the Las Vegas Raiders pretty much having a very easy strength of schedule. In fact, by average, it even got easier for them considering we eliminated the final 3 games of the fantasy football playoffs in the specific left side statistics, followed by the Jacksonville Jaguars, Houston Texans, Carolina Panthers, Denver Broncos, Washington football team. A lot of these teams, their quarterbacks aren't the studs. Like, where are the stud quarterbacks? Number 7, Arizona Cardinals, great. Then we have the Rams at number 8, the Chiefs at number 10. It's great to see Patrick Mahomes could have a great season, going forward. We have the Baltimore Ravens at 13. We have the Bills at 15. Those are some of the top quarterbacks. In fact, like Kyler, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, consensus-wise, those are the top 4 quarterbacks. And the rest of the way, having great strength of schedules, that is beautiful to see. In terms of the fantasy football playoffs, as at this current moment in time, the Philadelphia Eagles have a cakewalk of a schedule. And of course, from what we've already seen from Jalen Hurts, the guy is probably going to be a top 5 quarterback end of season. He hasn't produced less than 20 fantasy points per game. He's coming off of back-to-back weeks of 2 rushing touchdowns and over 40 rushing yards, just cleaning up on the ground and just being an overall monster. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers, if Big Ben wants to improve going forward, gets healthy from some of the pec, shoulder, elbow, hip injuries. He is in a full body cast at this point in terms of injuries. If he wants to improve, could be an option there. As for the potential of the 49ers, if they get to the late half of the season, and we have a situation in which they cannot make the playoffs, and Jimmy Garoppolo is not producing well, and Trey Lance is given the opportunity to take over, the strength of schedule, like we talked about in the offseason, has stayed true, and it looks like the 49ers and potentially Trey Lance could be a league-winning quarterback. We talked about it in the offseason. That's what enticed a lot of people to drafting him. And obviously, he's eating a bench slot at this moment, but could be something to keep an eye on. Some of these other teams, of course, present themselves very good overall matchups, and the opposition doesn't really stop opposing quarterbacks thus far this season. It could change going forward, but for the other side of the spectrum, Brady has the toughest strength of schedule. Let's just put it into account. In the last 2 seasons, Patrick Mahomes has had the toughest strength of schedules in 2019 and in 2020. I don't know if it was the league obviously trying to mess with him after, of course, they had such successful seasons after 2018, but it seems like for some reason, like the Super Bowl winning quarterback of that given year, the next year just somehow, some way has the toughest strength of schedule. Regardless, it doesn't matter. It's Brady. We move on. Let's talk about the final position for the strength of schedule for the 2021 fantasy football season. That is the tight end position. Again, we've talked about it. Tight ends, typically you're playing your studs, and very little of the guys that we're going to talk about today are going to be guys that you could potentially pick up and play going forward. But if in fact they're an option in your league, I want to mention them because they could help us going forward. As for the defenses versus the tight end position, thus far this season, on average, between weeks 1 through 5.5 PPR scoring format, we presented this in yesterday's video as we talked about quarterback and tight end rankings. The Houston Texans, Baltimore Ravens, Indianapolis Colts, Kansas City Chiefs, Chargers, Tampa Bay, they are giving up the most points to opposing tight ends. And at least one of those things came true. Tampa Bay, Zach Ertz scored a touchdown, the next day gets traded. We'll talk about that later. But nonetheless, that just kind of gives you some context as to how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing tight ends thus far this season. And it's extremely valuable because typically you don't want to play your team's tight ends against the Cardinals or the Titans or the Broncos or the Patriots because they really do lock down tight ends. And it's just a fact. And they've done it over a multi-year basis. So with that being taken into context, if you go ahead and you take that difficulty of schedule and you expand it for the rest of the season for every single team, we found that the rest of season strength of schedule at the tight end position, the easiest average schedule belongs to the New York Giants tight ends, then the Denver Broncos, Washington football team, Cincinnati Bengals, and then the Miami Dolphins. Well, to be honest, these are tight ends that may not be the biggest of names, but we have Evan Ingram, Noah Fant, Logan Thomas, Mike Gesicki, Dallas Goedert, who will have the entire tight end room to himself once he comes back from his injured reserve reign that he has right now. Darren Waller is up in that conversation with the Las Vegas Raiders, having the 6th, 7th easiest strength of schedule, There are some other teams here that we could potentially look at. The New England Patriots with Hunter Henry, the Arizona Cardinals, now with Zach Ertz. That's something to keep an eye on. Unfortunately, on the very bottom of the screen, TJ Hawkinson is on exile island of sorts. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Survivor. Anyway, he is on his own island in the idea that he unfortunately has the toughest strength of schedule at the position, but he's not alone in this factor. We also have the Dallas Cowboys, Dalton Schultz, Mark Andrews over there, in the tougher region. We have George Kittle down there as well, and we're not going to worry about those guys. So why worry about TJ Hawkinson? I know he's been dealing with an injury, but just kind of keep a level head about it and don't blow it out of major proportions. Regardless, now that I've presented these statistics, I want to move on and separate it from week 6 through 14 in the fantasy football playoffs. As you can see from the very left side of the screen, it's very similar as to what we particularly presented from week 6 through 17. The 3-game difference often doesn't make a huge overall impact on the rest of season strength of schedule, but as for the fantasy football playoffs, what could we potentially take advantage of for the tight end position? Quite frankly, not a lot unless Zach Ertz is somehow available in your league or unless you're willing to go after him in a trade because the Jets don't really have a tight end. Ertz is great for the Cardinals. Hunter Henry's been fantastic. Jared Cook could be an option. CJ Uzomah, nope. I'm not dealing with that. Logan Thomas coming off IR could be great. The Saints tight ends hasn't done anything along with Houston. Jacksonville Jaguars, Dan Arnold could be good going forward. He's only been with the team for a couple weeks and is honestly getting a good amount of targets. It could end up progressing in the right direction in that regard. The Eagles with Goddard on a solo run could be great. Robert Tonyan has done absolutely nothing, but in the fantasy football playoffs could come in clutch. We're just going to have to wait and see. Everything could change by the time we get there. But these numbers and these strength of schedules look a lot similar to what we kind of anticipated before the season even began. And though there has been fluctuation because of player injuries and or injuries to defensive players, hopefully this gives you an entire context as to which players you should potentially be going after based on their rest of season strength of schedules, which players you should be holding on to. If somebody comes knocking on your door for Najee Harris, let's not give him up for just peanuts. He is balling out, and he has an extremely easy strength of schedule going forward. And there are a lot of other running backs that are in that specific scenario, and wide receivers and tight ends and quarterbacks that we have to keep an eye on and hold close to our team, because they're going to help us win a 2021 fantasy football championship. Hopefully this video helped you guys. If it did, smash the like button down below. We'll of course do this later on in the season as we progress closer to the fantasy football playoffs, so we can have a greater context before your trade deadlines, so you can, pretty much try to set yourself up with the best roster that can win you a 2021 fantasy football championship. For those of you who haven't subscribed already, be sure to do so. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, if you use promo code Andrew today with your first deposit of $10 or more, you'll be given an additional $10 in bonus cash, so you can play whether it is pick'ems, different contests, whether it is the NFL, college football, NBA, NHL, MLB, fantasy football all day, the Underdog way. Thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate it. Tomorrow we'll talk about some hidden gems for week 6 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Sunday morning live stream, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirikoff, answering questions, updated rankings to help you get your lineup set. I'm here to help. Thank you very much. And until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.